Elections in America are all over the place. They're confusing and complicated. There are so many different types of elections with different sets of rules that it can be hard to keep it all straight. So, where do we begin? Let's start with some really basic election rules. In America, elected officials represent electoral districts. Electoral districts are geographic regions of states containing equal populations, except in Senate elections where the entire states are the electoral districts, and the presidential election which uses the Electoral College. But more on that in a minute. So that leaves the rest of American elections, including the House of Representatives, most state legislatures except for these, and most local governments to be governed by two major rules: single-member district representation and plurality vote. To explain single-member district representation, let's cut Iowa into 5 imaginary congressional districts. Single-member district means that overall, one person will be elected from each district to represent that district, except in those other states because they use multi-member districts, in which multiple members are assigned to a legislative body. This election rule shows who representatives represent, but how do they actually get elected? This is where the other major election rule comes in: plurality vote, except in Georgia and Louisiana. Plurality vote means that whoever gets the most votes wins, regardless of whether they have a majority. Georgia and Louisiana use majority rule, which means that a candidate must win at least 50% of all votes to win the election. Let me explain plurality vote using imaginary numbers. Say in all 5 fake Iowa districts, a Republican candidate wins 40% of the vote, a Democratic candidate wins 35% of the vote, and a Green Party candidate wins 25% of the vote. Because of the plurality vote rule, the Republican candidates win every single district, leaving the Republican Party to govern the state, even though a majority of the population affiliate differently. This is a big problem because, practically speaking, the winning candidate, no matter which party they affiliate with, is likely to govern in accordance with their political ideologies, even if their party is a minority. Plurality vote seems good on the surface, but it can lead to some very undemocratic situations, like minority ruling the majority, as in this imaginary Iowa case. And when you think about it, this is especially problematic for third and minor parties. Because unless all of the third party's members move to one district, they will hardly ever be able to beat anyone in our two-party system. And even if they manage to win 1 or 2 elections, that's only 1 or 2 representatives, which can be massively disproportionate to the number of people who are members of that party. For a real-life example, look to the Libertarian Party. There are 27 states that report libertarian registration statistics, and with these numbers, there are just shy of 500,000 registered libertarians. There are likely more, but assuming that 500,000 is all there is, that makes libertarians 0.2% of the voting eligibility population, meaning people who are able to vote. Libertarians have 0 representatives in Congress. Now, granted, this isn't a very large percentage overall, but stepping back from that whole, 500,000 people is a lot of people that have no representation. If our election rules didn't heavily favor a two-party system, third parties would likely have more of a chance, and with that, many more members. Let's go back and talk about senatorial and presidential elections. Senate elections use the multi-member district rule, except in the case of Senate elections, the district is the entire state. Multi-member, of course, because each state has 2 senators. The extra weird election is the presidential election, which uses the Electoral College. In a very brief explanation of the Electoral College, states are given a number of electors equal to the number of representatives plus their number of senators. DC is just given 3 electors. Again, the entire state is the district, except in Maine and Nebraska, which assign 1 elector to the candidate who won the respective congressional district, and the remaining electors to the statewide winner. This is a form of proportional representation, but we'll get to that in a minute. All of the state's electors will cast their vote to the candidate who wins the popular vote, and the candidate that wins over 50% of the electors wins the Electoral College and thus the presidency. As you might be aware, the popular vote only matters because it instructs the electors on how to vote. The only vote that decides the presidential election is the electors' vote in the Electoral College system. It is possible for a candidate to win the popular vote and lose the election. In the election of 1824, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but no candidate won a majority of the electoral votes. And in such a situation, the House of Representatives decides who becomes the president, and they chose John Quincy Adams. In the election of 1876, Samuel J. Tilden won the popular vote, but there were 20 unresolved electoral votes. In a very heated debate over the election, a deal known as the Compromise of 1877 was made, which gave Rutherford B. Hayes the 20 elector votes and thus the presidency in exchange for effectively ending Reconstruction. In the election of 1888, Grover Cleveland won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote to Benjamin Harrison. In the election of 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote to George Bush. And of course, in the election of 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote to Donald Trump. After hearing about all these different types of elections and rules, you may be thinking, well, yeah, it's weird, but how else would we do it? The person who wins the most votes wins the election. That's how democracy works. Yes and no. A majority of other democratic countries use what's called proportional representation. In a proportional representation system, people vote for parties, not individual candidates. Basically, a country will set a minimum vote threshold, say 5%, and parties that can hit that threshold receive seats based on their proportion of the vote. In another made-up example, pretend there are 100 seats for whatever governing body. Party A wins 27% of the votes, Party B wins 23% of the vote, Party C wins 18% of the vote, Party D wins 15% of the vote, Party E wins 12% of the vote, and Party F wins 5% of the vote. All of these parties get representation in the national governing body. Even the smallest parties can be represented. In America, it's common to think that your vote doesn't matter, or that voting third party is a waste of a vote. A proportional representation system addresses and remedies some of these issues. All in all, it's an interesting system and something to give some serious thought. There's one final type of election that citizens have the ability to initiate that you may not know about, and that's called a recall election. Before we get into this, an important bit of information is that neither members of Congress nor the president are subject to recall elections. Recall elections allow for the removal and replacement of state officials by popular vote of the citizen. Note that recall elections are different than impeachment. Impeachment's a legislative process that can happen in every state, while only these 19 states allow for the recall of state officials. Now, all of these states have slightly different variations and requirements for recall elections, but in general, the way it works is that a certain percentage of voters who voted in the election in question must petition to have a recall election. When the percentage threshold is met, a formal election is held where people vote on whether or not to remove the relevant official. While only 19 states allow the recall of state officials, these 34 states have at least some rules for recalling local officials. Of course, the rules for these recall elections are extremely varied, so if you're interested, I'll leave a link in the description where you can check your state's rules. So, in summary, we elect one official, except when we don't, by the decision of plurality vote, except when it isn't, to represent equal populations of people, except when they're not, by governing us in office unless we recall them. That's America.